Okay. I'll just pull this too in case it gets loud. Hopefully some people will show up. All right. I haven't gotten to the papers yet. I still have a couple of online tests to grade, and then I'll start working on the papers, which, for my folks online, I start the papers with the ones that have been handed in, so the ones online are going to have to take a back seat. But I'll eventually get to it, and I tend to put the paper grades online like immediately. But if you have physically turned them in, I'll hand them back. So, yeah, any questions about anything before we get started? All right. Again, because I know that I'm going to be getting emails from my online folks, this test will be 4 chapters. So, although we're probably going to finish chapter 9 today, we're not done yet. So, chapter 10 is the end of the Middle Ages, so I feel we just include that in there. I think that's how the book had originally intended it, because I had like these online resources back when I was at Tri-County, and they mashed the 4 together like that. I hope that's how I have my tests. Although now that I think about it, I think I usually just put however many we finish on the last one, so I might be getting ahead of myself. I don't know. I'll decide over the weekend, because this is the only day we have this week. Anyway, we ended with communes, one of which, or the first of which is talked about here, ended up being rather violent. But basically this idea of people coming together in a town. I guess the modern day example would be like forming a city council to govern themselves, as opposed to being ruled by the church or the king. Well, really not even the king, but like the local noble. Because as we mentioned, the king really didn't have a lot of power at the time. Whatever land you were living on, you dealt with the noble. There really wasn't much going over their head. So, the church was becoming very powerful at this time, both in terms of money and politics, as we've seen with, make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself again. Yeah, we talked about Pope Innocent. Between Gregory the Great and Pope Innocent, the church was seen as this organization above even like kingdom governments. However, those who questioned the church, which is to say the Pope, or anti-papists as they were called, were immediately branded heretics and either persuaded back into the fold, which is to say, I was going to go straight to torture. It was often torture, but oftentimes also just like, hey, you're against the church, therefore you can't buy or sell goods in any towns we control, which is a good way to convince someone to see your side of things, because when you can't make money or even buy things, you're not going to last real long. Or if they felt like persuasion wasn't good enough, they'd burn them at the stake. Typically was the way it was done. We have the Cathars, which was a particular group mentioned in this section. They believed all things in the world were evil. They refused to eat meat, practiced self-denial, ritual starvation. The leaders, the good men or perfected one, typically would starve themselves to death. It was not a very strong organization. However, the Pope sponsored a crusade against these people. First, they sent in missionaries to basically tell these people, hey, you probably want to drop this and come back to the Catholic Church because we're about to bring in soldiers. And those that stuck around got themselves murdered by the soldiers led by Simon Fourth de Montfort. Now, there was more reason to this than just the Pope didn't like this group because they disagreed with papal teachings. The land that the Cathars held was, I believe, in southern France. So it was really, really good land for growing things and therefore worth a lot of money. So, working with the Pope, Simon de Montfort went in and murdered the local nobles under the guise of a crusade, and with the Pope's blessing, took this land for himself. Because, medieval politics. Also, obviously, Jews were in a bad place. That's just kind of a constant throughout history. Most were forced to wear a symbol of their religion so that they could be picked out from the Christians. 1182, King Philip of France expelled all Jews from his kingdom. And again, not as much because, hey, they're not Christians, therefore we don't want them here. It was, hey, the Jews have a lot of property, and we can use this as an excuse to kick them out of the country and then take their property and money for ourselves. There was a lot of that. We'll see this again in 104. It was like right after this major war, very early in 104, of course, where there was this huge war of religion, and by the end of the day, it was like, all right, well, we're going to tolerate religions when this was in Protestants and Catholics, tolerate religions other than the one that's the main state religion. And within 5 years, France was expelling all Jews and Muslims from the nation anyway, because France does what it wants. So, further growth in the church, the mendicant orders. These were friars, or begging friars as they were known. This was something I mentioned back the last chapter, I think, where the bishops and monks were, basically on the ground floor, working with the people. But now, as time has gone on, monks and bishops are much more wealthy and refuse to lower themselves to the, dirty peasants on the side of the road. So the friars were created as a way to fill that gap. They swore off all property, begged in the streets, and were part of the community. We have two main orders, the Franciscans and Dominicans. The college I went to up in Rhode Island, Providence College, it's a Dominican seminary. They train Dominican friars there. They wear the robes and the rosaries and everything. They walk around campus. It's like when I went to Ireland, I was on a campus that trained, I think, nuns specifically. And yet I felt like I was more in a Catholic culture in Rhode Island because they're so, I guess because in Ireland, it's just the norm. They don't even, there's not really any, there's not as much emphasis on it, I guess is the way I'm trying to put it. Whereas in Rhode Island, where it's a lot of Irish, they're really, really proud of their roots and really, really proud of their culture. So it's more prevalent because for them it's like a major part of their pride, whereas in Ireland it's just like an everyday thing. So yeah, like I think I know one of my professors in Providence College was a friar because he came in with a robe and everything. And I don't think I had a teacher in Ireland who was specifically like a member of the clergy, but there were plenty of them on campus. I mean, you could just like walk in and have a chat with a nun, which here in the South, where there's not a lot of Catholic representation, just mostly Protestant churches. That just seems almost like going back in time. The Dominicans, as we're going to see a little bit later, are notorious for, well, straight up the Inquisition. That's what the Dominicans did. They were known as the hounds of God. Like, they were real aggressive with what they did. The Franciscans, I don't remember what they specifically did, but they were just a different group from the Dominicans. Yeah, so they would investigate charges of heresy, which is to say, do an inquisition, but they would be the leading edge of that, where they'd go in and be like, hey guys, maybe you shouldn't do the heresy because we got soldiers behind us and they're not so good about asking questions. That said, a lot of inquisitions weren't so much, hey, stop doing what you're doing and come be a good Catholic, and more, hey, we think you're doing this thing whether we can prove it or not, and we're going to torture and kill you anyway. That's what the Spanish Inquisition is remembered for. Pope Gregory IX formalized the process of Inquisition, overseen by friars, which is to say this was investigating the Cathars before they sent in Simon IV. So yeah, Inquisition, while it's remembered today as the pointy end, initially is literally just an investigation. They're inquiring about what's going on and seeing if the charges of heresy are legitimate before they send in the troops. By the time we get to the Spanish Inquisition, it's more like charges of witchcraft, where it's, we think you're doing this thing, therefore we're going to torture and kill you. And most of the time, the inquiring by the time of the Spanish Inquisition was, hey, admit to this thing that we charged you with, and if you don't, we'll torture you until you admit to it. So yeah, it wasn't great. Also, I want to apologize in advance for this next image. As I said, I went to Providence College, where they trained Dominican friars, and apparently their mascot is this. Yeah, it's horrible. Actually, I specifically use a preview mode on my slides now so that I can see this before it comes up. I didn't do that when I was upstate, and I had this come up and forgot I had put it up, and it scared me. He's been voted multiple times the scariest sports mascot. And his name's Dom, because, Dominican, D-O-M. They have a fire dog too for some reason, as a secondary mascot. I think that's the main one now, but he's still around. He was the mascot when I was there. I didn't go to games. Granted, I'm not big into sports, but also I didn't want to deal with this. Anyway, there's some friars doing their thing. Preaching to the people, helping them with what they need. Also, here's a ton of dogs. But, yeah. So, also apologies. That image is on the PowerPoints that I put up online. So, you won't be able to get away from it. All right. So, as far as the creation of the various nations in Europe, we've got three major areas. In England and France are sort of considered their own are considered an area together. You've got Germany and Italy, which had the Holy Roman Empire and papal states nearby, which would very often bleed into the way they did things. And then finally, the imperial papacy was its own sphere of political influence. I mean, we've already seen a lot of that. That's not news. So, with England and France, one, they were a little further away from the papacy, but they had strict or set geographic boundaries. I mean, obviously England, they're an island. You get to the ocean and you're done. Now, granted, there was the northern border with Scotland, which is a whole separate thing. But for the most part, you've got set borders in England. France, slightly less so. In the south, it went to what is the name of those mountains? I don't know. It's not set on here. The mountains between Spain and France, where the Moors still were. So that was definitely a border for France, and then obviously the ocean in the north and west. On the east, there was the border between the Holy Roman Empire and France, and it was a little bit fluid. Typically, they stuck with rivers and mountains and whatnot for that, but compared to the Holy Roman Empire, where it's just this big blob, England and France were more organized, formalized taxes, hierarchies, and also the royal power was more, powerful than the nobles. So unlike in the Holy Roman Empire, where it's just a bunch of nobles running all over the place, things were a bit more like what we would think of in the modern, when we think of from today, like the Middle Ages. You've got the king on top, and then his nobles below him, and then below them are the peasants. That's how it was in England and France. The rest of Europe, not so much. I'm going to get to the rest of Europe in just a minute. The Italian city-states were interesting in how they did things. Again, going back to Greece, you had the polis, where each little city was its own political power. There was no overall Greece, and then each city was part of that. They were their own little things, and the idea of Greece was a cultural thing. Same with Italy. Each city-state was typically its own little nation, and they were only Italian in so much as they lived on the peninsula of Italy and spoke Italian. Sometimes, some of them did. But when it came to global stuff, trade, wars, they were very much independent of one another. And as we're going to see getting towards the Renaissance, very, very powerful. This is important. You can tell because I put it in bold. The Magna Carta, which is Old English, and Old English being mostly French. This is for the Great Charter. This was signed by King John of England at Runnymede in 1215. Basically, this was the earliest, I shouldn't say earliest because there's a lot of other little things happening. This is the biggest and earliest example of it wasn't a constitution, but it was the same idea, where we're putting in writing what the king could do, what the king couldn't do, and what powers the nobility had. So this transferred a lot of the power from the king to the nobility. Now, granted, really up until, when was William and Mary? The 1700s? Well, 1600s. The king is still very much over the nobility, but in order for the king to do things, for the king to go to war, for the king to raise taxes, for the king to, do any major countrywide stuff, he had to bring his nobles in to have counsel with them, which is to say, this more or less created Parliament. Now, granted, this was still the nobility. So this wasn't the average man had the ability to change or form the government. But it was more than just the king doing his thing. So we're moving in the right direction. There were also a lot of small representative governments. There were all sorts of little local assemblies, again, like we saw with the commune, where towns and villages and whatnot would pass their own laws, pass their own little taxes and whatnot. Now, granted, if the king came in and decided he wanted things to be a certain way, there wasn't much they could do about it. They couldn't hold a vote to disagree with the king. It's like, all right, well, the king says this, so that's it, unless the local noble was on their side. But for the most part, you didn't really have to deal with the king. You were in a little town, you lived in that town, you died in that town, you never saw the king. You probably never saw the noble that owned your town or owned the land around your town. So locally, things were kind of representative. And then on the larger scale, thanks to this is, again, a major deal for the future. The nobility could somewhat dampen the power of the king. I mean, we go as far back as the Magna Carta when we were writing the Declaration of Independence, or not the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. But yeah, this is one of the. This is the first major part of what's known as the English common law. There isn't like a specific English constitution they go back to whenever they want to do stuff. It's a series of a bunch of documents over time because, I mean, they're not like 250 years old. England is very old. So they have this collection of documents that altogether forms English common law. So you can actually, some laws actually will go back and like reference the Magna Carta. Like that, this is such a major foundational thing in English government, which in turn influences us over here. So that's why that's all that. And this is one of the major things quoted in that sidebar I told you guys about for the second/final paper. In 1215, the Magna Carta was signed. That's a major important thing in this year where there's lots of stuff going on, and can often be quoted as like an example of the High Middle Ages not being so bad. Things weren't terrible because we had some level of representation. Anyway, here's the king signing the charter. Again, they just like erected a little tent, put down not necessarily a rug, but so he wouldn't literally get muddy. And they signed this out here so that he wouldn't be in his palace. He would be out here among the people, literally in the middle of a field, to sign this thing. So the way that medieval treatises describe kings, they should be loved and feared just as God was, because they were essentially representatives of God in the political sphere, even if the Pope was already in the political sphere a lot too. So the king after William the Conqueror died was Henry II. He stopped rebellions in Scotland and Wales, and he's probably one of the main reasons why Wales has so many freaking castles. All the castles in Wales are not just there to look pretty. They were forts to control the countryside. That's why Wales has so many castles, because Wales was causing so much trouble for England. Scotland, it'd still be a little while before Scotland is part of England, but they're being influenced by England. He organized regional authority because he spent most of his time across the ocean, or across the channel in Normandy. Because technically the King of England is the Duke of Normandy. And technically, Normandy is like their home base. England is just sort of a separate little side thing that they've got now. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine, who is also someone that's often written about for the second paper. People like writing on Eleanor. She was very cool. She got a lot done in a time when women really weren't able to do much. She, along with her 3 sons, including a young Richard, rebelled against Henry II. The book doesn't go into detail about like him being overthrown, but apparently they were very much opposed to Henry. This was also, for those of you that have had to read the Canterbury Tales, it's Henry II's fault. He had disputes with the church, particularly an old friend of his, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. During one particular argument, after Becket left, Henry muttered, or probably yelled, "Won't someone rid me of this troublesome bishop?" So the knights were like, "Hey, we can do that." And so they followed Becket back to his cathedral and murdered him on the altar. This is often quoted, specifically Henry's quote, when people talk about stochastic terrorism, I think is the proper term. Basically where, in particular, large public officials say something that is interpreted by the listeners as a call to violence. So while the king didn't specifically say, "Boy," or specifically say, "Hey, knights, go murder this guy for me," what he said was interpreted as essentially an order, or at least a suggestion that the bishop should be gotten rid of. So when you've got political leaders being like, "Boy, it sure would be great if someone lined these people up and shot them," you can't do that. It's not technically a command, but it's inciting terrorism, or at least inciting violence. So Henry's son, Richard the Lionheart, a very well-known king, he was a king for 10 years, and less than 6 months of that was actually spent in England. Because once again, Normandy is their home base. England is just sort of a side bit of land they won a couple of generations back. He also depleted the treasury because he wasn't a very good king. He was busy going to war and fighting people and just spending money. And he barely even spoke English because, again, he was French. He was a French noble and barely actually spent any time in England. However, because he was this swashbuckling crusader who went to the Holy Land to murder people for the sake of the Pope, the people thought he was great. Which I guess it's really the English thing, and then that very much bled into our own independence movement. We like political leaders who don't bother us. He wasn't ever in England, and that wasn't seen as a bad thing by the English. Like, hey, he's not even here, so he must be all right. And as I talked about the last time we talked about Richard, he's the reason why his brother had to raise all the taxes in England, because he got captured on the way back from Crusade, and they had to raise money to basically pay his ransom. And he wasn't and to further emphasize, he wasn't captured by like the Muslims. He was captured by an Austrian duke, and therefore held by the Holy Roman Emperor. Because while they were technically on the same side in the Crusade, they were still at odds with one another. So yeah, Richard, as much as he's loved and remembered even in history, wasn't that great. Anyway, here's Thomas Becket getting, the end of Henry suggesting we get rid of him. some reason. Oh, that must be Henry. I was going to say, that doesn't look like Richard. I don't know why I've got this. That must be the only thing I could find for Henry. And we've already seen a picture of Richard the Lionheart, so I don't have an extra one here. Frederick II, king of Sicily by 3, had the Pope as his guardian by 18, king of the Romans by 26, Holy Roman Emperor. Reclaimed Jerusalem through negotiation and political marriage, which is a hell of a thing considering how opposed Europe was to anything going on among the Islamic Turks. And he challenged the church on many assumed truths. So if you agree with the church, you hated the guy. If you thought the church maybe was a bit corrupt and had too much power, you probably thought he was great. And then we have St. Louis. He was the king of France, went on crusade twice, but ended up being captured in Egypt, so I guess on the second crusade. Sent emissaries to the Mongol Khans to try to convert them, so he basically was doing the same thing as the Pope. Persecuted Jews and Muslims, and took their property to pay for more churches, because, again, it's France. And on his second crusade, he died a, quote, good death, because, let's go full Klingon here, die a good death in battle. I guess it was better than Frederick Barbarossa, or was it Frederick Barbarossa? It's the next thing, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Where's Barbarossa? The one that died crossing a river. That's not so much a good death. Dying in battle is seen as a good death. Anyway, here's Frederick II with his weird little staff thing. And I guess he was into falconry, so that's pretty cool. Falconry is neat. And here is King Louis with his weird little staff. I don't know why. It's a Roman thing, but it's so weird. It's so weird. It's a little hand. It's so weird. Like, I get it. It's a symbol of, like, Roman authority because, the emperor would, just motion with his hand for things. I don't know. I hate it. I don't like it at all. Now, the fleur-de-lis, I can't speak today. The fleur-de-lis is cool. It's a great symbol. And I'm glad that France stuck with that. This I'm not a fan of. The demand for education continued to rise. So these single masters at cathedral schools couldn't keep up. So we eventually had places where masters could come together and then more students could be basically given education. Because before it was you had one dude and everybody that showed up, that was the guy that taught them. So we created the university. This was the creation of the university. At the tail end of this period, we'll talk more about that here. So the first problem with having a university was there was no books, or not very many. And the ones that they did have were typically just copies of the same book. There were a few areas in Greece and there were a few, centers of Greek texts in Europe, which is to say the monasteries, because, again, the monasteries weren't just there to copy Bibles, they also were making copies of non-biblical texts. Also in Byzantine and Islamic territories, many of these were taken from Jewish and Muslim holdings when the people were kicked out and their lands were taken. So gradually, and you can see how this starts to lead into the Renaissance, people became exposed to Plato and Aristotle and other classical masters. And this began to change the way people were taught in the Middle Ages, as well as just how people thought. Classical Greek thought came to the Latin world And really, like, it was, despite so much of the West being built on, the Roman Empire, which itself was heavily influenced by Greek teachings, things had changed so much over the centuries that bringing in Greek thought again really shook things up. Which, again, this is like the main focus of the Renaissance is classical thinking and teaching. So, between 1175 and 1200, universities cropped up all over Europe, in particularly places, large cities, Salerno, Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. And again, due to the limited number and variety of books, each university would focus on a specific curriculum, a specific area of study. Because, literally, if they find a book, that becomes what they base the university on. Today you've got specialist universities for certain things, but here it was literally like, for example, in Bologna, they found a book that Justinian had written, the Corpus of Civil Law, and so they basically built the university around that book. So this helped to create new civil law codes because, well, towns and cities were becoming a thing, again, for the first time in several centuries. So the ways to administer these towns and cities had been lost over the years, and finding this book meant they could, if not just straight up use the ways of, the Byzantine Empire, they could at least base their new laws on what had already been done. Because, that's how laws are today, especially court proceedings, is you don't just have a problem and make up something from thin air, unless you're dumb. You go back and see what's been done before, and while not necessarily just doing that again, you would use that as like a base for your decision. Especially if the thing that had been done before worked out really well. And the problem that you're having is something that's happened in the past. Bologna also received special protection from Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, because if you know anything about college towns, the local towns would try to charge really high taxes, rents, and food prices because they knew that the students and masters would be there, and you can't exactly commute back then. For example, when I was teaching upstate, our college was really just sort of an entry like how the Continuum is sort of an entry program into other colleges where you take some college courses and whatnot. I was working at a college, but it was a technical college, so most of the classes were, like Florence Darlington Tech stuff. But like college courses like I'm teaching today were, for the most part, it was literally called the bridge program. You would come in here, go there rather, take classes, and then transfer that directly into Clemson, which was like right up the road. The prices in Clemson were always higher than, for example, I lived in Anderson, because it's a college town. There's students who need a place to live. There's students there who need food and need gas to put in their cars to drive there. So, well, it wasn't as bad as things were back then, because again, specifically Frederick Barbarossa made it so this wouldn't be a thing. You still see it today. College towns tend to be more expensive simply because people there need things. So the university, Universitas Societas Magnasorum, Disciplinaric, University Association of Masters and Students. So they essentially were given guild status and all the rights and privileges therein. So again, just like with this, rather than Barbarossa just saying, hey, a college is important, we should give it certain protections from all this, he instead went back and looked at how the university was structured, and was like, hey, university is basically a guild. You have the masters who run the place and the students or the apprentices who come in to learn. So if we give them guild status, then they will be able to fight against these ridiculous taxes and rents and whatnot. So he used an old thing that was already in the books and applied it to this new idea. And so actually, I never really looked at it this way. But yeah, this is a perfect example of what I was just talking about, where you take an old idea and apply it to a modern thing. So yeah, and while this didn't apply to every university, because not all universities were under Frederick Barbarossa's control, this was typically how things went from that point on, where colleges and, well, specifically universities, were treated like a guild. So scholasticism, this was this university thought from, well, this 200-year period, 1150 to 1350, where they would bring logic and reason together to, well, form out ways to think about the world. In particular, we have Thomas Aquinas. He was a university student who became a Dominican friar. He actually did his book. I think the book mentions it. Where is it? No, that's still scholasticism. Where is Thomas Aquinas? Here we go. He trained at Monte Cassino, the monastery we literally talked about at the beginning of the chapter. No, not this chapter. It was like 2 chapters ago. Jeez. You remember Monte Cassino. It was like up on that mountain. It's really pretty. Anyway, his family may have hoped that he would someday obtain a high church office, but when the Emperor Frederick II expelled monks in 1239, he moved to the University of Naples, etc., etc. He chose to become a Dominican friar, much to the shock of his brothers, who kidnapped him and, in a medieval version of deprogramming, kept him cut off from his order and profession for a year in the hope that he would renounce his Dominican vow. The Middle Ages were nuts. Anyway, once he got out, he went to Cologne, studied under Albert the Great, yada, yada, yada. I just want to talk about him getting kidnapped by his brothers. I thought that was funny. Anyway, his main thing is synthesizing university thought, so this scholasticism, with the Christian faith. He wrote Summa Contra Gentiles? I know it's Gentiles, but it's French, so who knows. And Summa Theologica. I know that I can say this one because, again, I went to a Dominican college, and they were big on the Summa. They loved Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologica. Like, you'd have thought he was the president of the university. Now, this synthesizing of what was at this point ancient church doctrine and modern university thought was seen as radical and very much almost got him in trouble. He didn't get burned at the stake, at least. But he was not well looked upon by his peers. However, very, very quickly, the Catholic Church realized that this was a great way to maintain relevancy as university thought is progressing. So his ideals were very quickly rolled into standard Catholicism, which again is why at that college. They were big into the Summa Theologica. Despite, well, I guess I did technically take one religion course, but it was the Protestant Reformation, and that was the Catholic friar who was teaching it. It was a really interesting course. We'll get to the Protestant Reformation later. Anyway, there's Thomas Aquinas. Now, he was known as the dumb ox, not the most not the most polite nickname. Now, the ox bit comes from the fact that he was a big dude. He was built like a linebacker. Now, dumb didn't mean back then what it means today. Do you actually know what the actual meaning of dumb is? Today if we talk about someone who would back then have been called dumb, if you're a mute, if you don't speak, if you can't speak. Thomas Aquinas, he could speak. Now, I'm not saying he was a mute, but he tended to sit and listen and not say anything unless he had thought about it a while. Exactly. So he's this really big dude who's just sitting quietly in the corner. And in medieval ideas, if you're not saying anything, you don't even understand what's going on. You're just, like an ox. You're just sitting in the corner. Obviously, Aquinas knew what he was up to and got a lot done. But he, to this day, even by the people who love him, still use this term because now it's this like ironic thing of like, oh, he's this big guy that doesn't even talk. He doesn't know what he's doing, and he ends up being like one of the biggest intellectuals of the era. So yeah, Thomas Aquinas was pretty cool. So back to Gothic cathedrals, they continued to build upward. Beauvais reached 157 feet. However, its choir collapsed in a windstorm. And really, we got to the point that we couldn't build these churches any bigger. They physically could not, or the building materials that they used, timbers and stone, could not handle the physical stresses of that size. Literally until we get like wrought iron, you can't build things any bigger than this. So Gothic architecture moved towards a slightly new style called rayonnant, which is, I guess, French for radiant. So rather than going for as much height as possible, they focused on the stained glass windows and a smaller overall size. So when you're inside, you didn't feel like you were, in God's pantry. It was, again, I've been in a proper Catholic church now, and they are massive. Rayonnant churches, I'm going to show you a couple of images here in a minute. We're still big. But relatively speaking, they were smaller, they were full of light, and things felt, more intimate, more warm. Still pretty awe-inspiring, but you felt more comfy, I guess is a good way to put it. Also, university thought was reaching a peak and then began to diverge. You had a lot of really major disagreements within university thought at this period. Like to the point that they were like physically fighting each other because it's the Middle Ages. So I just have a ton of images of this Rayonnant art style. You of course have these fancy rose windows. I don't think this is, no, we already saw Chartres Cathedral. So again, this is your typical, you've got Jesus in the middle, and I think these are like aspects of his life. and his disciples. And I think this is the positions of the cross on the outside. Compare this, though, to this one, which is significantly more detailed. There is so much more going on, and it's really big. Here's one actually where you can see the, most of the time when you see rose windows, it's backlit, so the bits here are just blacked out. But if you see it from the other side, it's all gold leaf. So there's so much going on with these big rose windows. And there was one, at least one in every church. I think sometimes two. But like it would face, where the sun would, I think it faced north, so it would be as light as much as possible. And then you, of course, have the windows here. This is I shouldn't have had this with this one in the background because it just starts to make you kind of dizzy. But like there's the ceiling up here with these big vaulted things. Again, gold leaf all the way around. Just so much stained glass. If you recall from at the beginning of the chapter where it was like you had a couple of windows here and there, this is just like a wall of glass all the way around. Just really crazy. And again, when you've got the sun coming in these windows, it's casting these colors all over the floor. You're walking through colors. It's really something else. I mean, especially people back then, it was awe-inspiring. Which to me, just thinking about some of the ridiculous crap you see on the internet, where people are like, oh, if I could go back in time, I'd give a German peasant a Dorito or see his head explode. It's like, guys, they lived at a time where this was the norm. Now, they might not know about anything that tastes better than like boiled cabbage, but yeah, this was the time that people lived in. Things weren't all doom and gloom. That's next chapter. Which we're a little bit ahead, so I'm going to go ahead and move to that. Now that, thankfully, I have my have all my stuff. I really shouldn't put it all in one's flash drive. All right. So let's briefly open up on chapter 10. I hope this has been working all the time. Yes. Okay. I didn't have it opened at all. What's wrong with me? Where are we at? That's 101. So, the late Middle Ages. This is when things really began going poorly. Let's see, at what point did things stop going poorly? Let's see, I would definitely consider the 100 Years' War bad. Almost the entire chapter. So, we talked about the medieval warm period, about a 300-year period, 900 to 1200, where temperatures had improved so much across Europe that they were growing, vineyards in England. Temperatures began to drop pretty dramatically between 1270 and 1370, to the point that ice and glaciers began to advance along the northern hemisphere. This is the period when, for those of you that have had my American history course, this is when the Vikings got kicked out of North America, because they were way up north and the ice began to just spread over everything and they had to get out. Like, you can hang out in an area that is getting colder, but if a literal glacier is starting to encroach on your settlement, you got to leave. You can't do anything about that. Because if you're not aware, glaciers move. And I don't mean like, the big pieces of ice floating around in the ocean. They move across land. They gradually, over summers and winters, they'll melt and then refreeze and melt and refreeze. And while this is happening, they're gradually moving. For example, my friend in Wisconsin, Wisconsin's flat. It's just, it's fairly high above sea level, but it's just, there's nothing there in terms of like geography. Turns out it was because hundreds of thousands of years ago, the big glaciers from Canada had come through there and just literally flattened everything. Glaciers are crazy. Okay, once again, I get ahead of myself. This largely affected communities in the far north, in particular, for example, pushing the Norse out of Greenland, as well as North America. They were able to stay in Iceland, though, because, as I've said, despite the name, Iceland was actually the more green of the two, whereas Greenland was very icy. The Vikings did that on purpose. So as things began to cool down, summers became rainier, and while you think, oh, rain is good for crops, well, it flooded all the time, and so it destroyed whole fields. So places where the agriculture was the economy was getting wiped out. So northern France, for example, was in real bad shape economically, and things just get significantly worse from there. Whereas places that focused on mining, like in the German regions, or just trade, so northern Italy, were able to become these new, economic centers of Europe. So we have the basic temperature change here. Now, while it does say Celsius, I don't know like where the numbers would be, but you can see where it jumps and then it plummets during the little ice age here, where way below where it had been for quite some time. Yeah. Yeah, when I was in Ireland, my last week or so there, it was I want to say it was early June. Like their semesters ran really late, all through May. So the semester finished, I still had a couple of days there, and I was hanging out with my friend where were we? Were we in Dublin? We were somewhere. Oh no, we went to Kilkenny. We went to visit his family, and it got up to like 75, and he was complaining about it being like way too hot. Which, to be fair, since I had been there since like January and gotten used to it, 75 did feel kind of warm. Like it wasn't hurting me, but I was like, man, it's a little like I don't need to wear my long sleeve shirt. What's going on? Yeah. So it depends on where you are, which, like, they don't have, modern day, they don't have air conditioners there. England and Ireland, and I think France probably does, but they've just, for centuries, have never had weather get hot enough where that was ever a thing. So when air conditioners became a thing, they just never put them in the buildings, which, again, the buildings were usually already there, unlike today where you build the central air into the building. Yeah, they don't have air conditioning. Like even modern homes, if it gets hot, you open the window and you turn on a fan. If it's 90 degrees outside, you're out of luck. Which is why some of the recent heat waves have been so bad in that part of the world, because they can't go in and turn on the AC. And also they're just like not acclimatized to it, so it feels so much worse. So what happens when you have years and years of crops getting destroyed? Exactly. So due to a number of things, not just the weather, but they had a really high population, as we also mentioned last chapter, because of the medieval warm period. They were able to grow more stuff, And if you grow more stuff, you can feed more people, and if you can feed more people, the population grows. Well, now you've got this really high population, and all the food is gone. 7 years of crop failures back to back. This is something we don't really think too much about today, unless you're a farmer. But especially back then, the way that you would farm is you would grow your crops, and at the end of the year, when you harvest, you would put a percentage aside. Grain is the easiest because you use grain also as the seed. Like the grain that we're eating is literally just the seed of, say, wheat. So you would put a percentage of that aside as seed for the next year, use whatever you need for food, and then the excess you would sell. However, with these crop failures, they're getting less and less each autumn when it's harvest time. So by the end of it, they don't have any seed left. Like, it's that bad. The famine alone killed between 4 and 5 million people in a time when there was maybe 30 to, I don't know the actual numbers, like 30 to 50 million. It was, 3 to 5 million people dying of starvation, period, is terrible. But like, at a time when the population is smaller than like a couple of cities in the modern day, it was horrendous. Also, due to the shortage of grain prices jumped like 800%. So imagine, a loaf of bread. I distinctly remember buying bread just the other day. It was like $2 for a loaf. Imagine it being now $16. Especially at a time when you could barely afford the bread to begin with. This wasn't, oh man, my grocery bill is going to suck this week. It's I can't afford it. We're going to starve. So obviously, people would riot over this because when you're pushed to, hey, my children are starving, you do what needs to be done. And of course, those that survived the plague, especially the kids, were terribly weakened in terms of their immune system. So this is why the plague, which we'll not get into today, is why it's so bad, because the people who first experienced it were in the worst possible shape for the plague. Let's talk about Avignon. I think this might be... Yeah, because I don't want to get into the 100 Years' War yet. So let's talk about Avignon. King Philip IV of France and Pope Boniface VIII had some disagreements, typical government versus church stuff from back then. And this led to a division among his curia, which is the Pope's court, whether they should support the French king or the Pope for some reason. You would think that the Pope's court would support the Pope, but again, this is a time when the governments of Europe are heavily invested in what's going on in the church. So after King Philip died, or not King Philip, Pope Boniface died, the next Pope, Clement V, decided, you know what, France has been good to us, we're going to work with France, and moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon in southern France. Now, to be fair, Avignon is like one of the best regions in the world. Avignon is very, very lovely. Wonderful Mediterranean weather, lots of good land. Avignon's not a bad place to go. But this is basically putting the papacy, if not under the control of the French king, very much allied with them at the least. They were no longer this above everybody organization. They were working directly with France. Also, there was the Knights Templar. So they were formed after the First Crusade as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ in the Temple of Solomon, because, brevity is great for titles. Their main goal was protecting pilgrims who were traveling to the Holy Land, as well as dispensing charity to those who needed it. However, the First Crusade was many, many years ago, and because the way that people supported the church was by giving them land and money, the Templars had a lot of land and money. Eventually, they had Philip, in debt, because, again, they made a lot of money in donations, so they would use that money to loan money to people. Now, once again, though, usury was illegal, so the debt that Philip owed to the Knights Templar would never go up. He would not, like I have with my student loans, owe more, having already basically paid off the principal, and I now owe more than I, borrowed to begin with, because that's how that works. But because he didn't feel like paying off this debt, he had the Pope, who was, totally not just his lapdog, dissolve the knights on these various crimes, which I will read here. King Philip was heavily in debt and accused the order of holding secret and criminal ceremonies and perpetuating obscene and illegitimate acts, such as spitting on the cross. Which, I get that would be a bad thing, but why would you bother? Even if oh man, I hate the Catholic Church, I'm going to spit on the cross. Why? They also accused the knights of practicing idolatry, holding heretical beliefs, participating in sexual crimes, and corrupting the handling of donations, which, the papacy tended to get up to, but we'll just leave that alone. Anyway, so the knights were dissolved due to these made-up charges. The leaders were tortured and executed, and all of this was at the blessing of the Pope. So, not a great time to be a Templar. Technically, the organization was destroyed back then, but it's around now. They're like Masons or other little, quote, secret societies where they just, I've got an image here in just a minute, they just meet and talk about stuff. My uncle's a member of the local Elks Lodge in Florence, and we've been there before, and it's just like where a bunch of old dudes come together and drink and talk about stuff. It's just like a private club. Here's Avignon. It's very, very pretty. This is specifically the Papal Palace in Avignon. Do I have a... No, I'm thinking of a different... I feel like I had a reflecting pool, but that's a different area entirely. And, the Templars... so here's a Templar... what's left of a Templar, fort / monastery. Again, very, very pretty. And it's an interesting, different sort of style here, where it's the rounded top, as opposed to just a big square. There's the Templars getting... I don't know of a funny way to say it. So yeah, there's the Templar being burned at the stake. That's no better way to put it. I don't know why this guy looks like he's having a great time. But yeah, because maybe, but I doubt it. And they always had these little fort things going on. But like I said, Templars still exist today. Going back to this, oh no, they're a big scary society. Not so much. They're just some old dudes with funny hats. specifically, look at that hat. I like this guy's hat. You know that thing sheds, though. When you've got stuff with feathers, it's just the moment you touch it, they're everywhere. Anyway, we are at the end of our time, and I don't want to get too far into this chapter, having just finished the other one. So, yeah, we'll end here. We'll get into stuff that the Holy Roman Empire is up to, and then the 100 Years' War, which, spoiler, lasted a while. We might even talk, we'll very likely get into the plague next time as well. So yeah, this is a half week, so I'll see y'all on Monday.